Imagine being so cold that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Imagine temperatures so brutal that exposed skin turns black in minutes. Now imagine being trapped in this frozen hell with no way out, watching people around you slowly give up hope one by one. This is not a movie. This is not fiction. This actually happened. In the winter of 1978, in the remote wilderness of Alaska, 23 people found themselves stranded in the most dangerous cold snap in recorded history. The temperature had dropped to minus 71 degrees Celsius. Their vehicles were dead. Their radios were silent. Their food was running out. One by one, they began to accept their fate. All except one man, a cowboy from Texas who had never seen snow until he was 30 years old. While others huddled in their shelters waiting to die, he made a decision that everyone called suicide. He decided to walk back into that killing cold to find help. What happened next became one of the most incredible survival stories ever documented. A story of human courage that defies belief. A story that proves sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate moments. This is that story. Every word of it is true. The convoy of vehicles moved slowly through the Alaskan wilderness like a mechanical snake, winding through the frozen landscape. 23 people spread across 6 vehicles, all heading toward the remote mining camp of Coldfoot, Alaska. It was January 15, 1978, and what had started as a routine supply run was about to become a fight for survival that would test every person to their absolute limit. Jack Morrison adjusted his cowboy hat and squinted through the windshield of the lead truck. At 42 years old, he was an unlikely figure in this frozen wasteland. Born and raised in the heat of West Texas, Jack had spent most of his life under blazing sun, herding cattle across dusty plains. He had never seen snow until he turned 30. Now, 8 years later, he found himself driving supply trucks through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, drawn north by the promise of good money and steady work. The temperature gauge in his truck read minus 48 degrees Celsius, but Jack knew it was getting colder. Much colder. The weather reports from Fairbanks had been talking about an Arctic blast moving in, something the meteorologists were calling unprecedented. But weather reports seemed like abstract concepts when you were already living in what felt like the frozen edge of the world. Behind Jack's truck, the rest of the convoy struggled through the deepening snow. There was Maria Santos, a cook from the mining camp who was returning from her monthly supply trip to Fairbanks. She drove alone, her small pickup truck loaded with food and medical supplies. In the third vehicle, a large cargo truck, rode 4 miners returning from their break, tough men who had spent years working in conditions that would break most people, but who were now facing something none of them had experienced before. The fourth truck carried Tom Bradley, a communications technician, along with his wife Susan and their 8-year-old daughter Emma. They were relocating to Coldfoot for Tom's new job, their entire life packed into the back of their truck. Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the endless white landscape roll by, unaware that she was about to become part of one of the most harrowing survival stories in Alaska's history. The fifth vehicle held Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a medical researcher studying the effects of extreme cold on human physiology. Ironically, she was about to get a much more direct education in her field of study than she had ever planned. With her were 2 graduate students, Mike and David, both eager young men who had volunteered for this trip, thinking it would be an adventure. The last truck in the convoy carried supplies and equipment driven by Robert Bear Johnson, a massive man who had earned his nickname through both his size and his ability to survive in the wilderness. Bear had been living in Alaska for 15 years, longer than anyone else in the convoy, and he understood the dangers of the northern wilderness better than most. As the day wore on, the snow began falling harder. What had started as light flurries in the morning had transformed into a steady snowfall that was beginning to reduce visibility. Jack checked his radio, trying to raise the base station at Coldfoot, but got only static in return. This wasn't unusual. Radio communications in this part of Alaska were unreliable at the best of times. The convoy had been traveling for 6 hours when the first truck broke down. It was Maria's pickup, the engine simply seizing up in the extreme cold despite being designed for Arctic conditions. Jack stopped the convoy and walked back to check on her, his breath forming instant clouds of ice crystals in the brutal air. "Engine's dead," Maria called out, her voice muffled by the heavy scarf wrapped around her face. "Won't turn over at all." Jack nodded grimly. He had seen engines fail in extreme cold before, but usually not until temperatures dropped below minus 50. The fact that Maria's truck had died at minus 48 was not a good sign. It meant the cold was more severe than their equipment could handle. "We'll redistribute your supplies," Jack decided. "You can ride with Tom and his family. We need to keep moving." But even as they worked to transfer Maria's supplies to the other trucks, Jack could see the worry in everyone's eyes. If one truck had failed, others might follow, and they were still hours away from Coldfoot, traveling through terrain where help was not just unlikely, it was impossible. The convoy started moving again, now down to 5 vehicles. The snow was falling so heavily that Jack could barely see the road ahead, even with his headlights on full beam. The wind had picked up too, creating whiteout conditions that forced him to slow their pace to a crawl. 2 hours later, Tom Bradley's truck gave up. The engine made a horrible grinding sound, and then fell silent. Tom tried desperately to restart it, but like Maria's truck, it was completely dead. The extreme cold had frozen vital engine components beyond the point where they could function. Now they were down to 4 vehicles, and Jack made the difficult decision to abandon some of their supplies. They redistributed the people. Tom, Susan, and Emma squeezed into Bear's truck with Maria, while Dr. Profession, Chen, took the 2 graduate students in her vehicle. The temperature continued to drop. Jack's thermometer now read minus 55 degrees Celsius, and the wind was creating a wind chill that made the actual temperature feel even more deadly. Exposed skin would freeze solid in less than 2 minutes in these conditions. Then disaster struck in rapid succession. Dr. Chen's truck died next, followed almost immediately by one of the cargo trucks. Within the span of 30 minutes, the convoy had been reduced from 6 vehicles to just 2. Jack's lead truck and Bear's supply truck. 14 people now had to squeeze into 2 vehicles designed to carry maybe 8 people comfortably. They sat pressed against each other, sharing body heat, while their abandoned trucks disappeared into the white void behind them. "How much further to Coldfoot?" Susan Bradley asked, holding her daughter Emma close. Jack checked his map and GPS unit, though the GPS signal was weak and unreliable. "Maybe 40 miles, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But even as he said it, Jack could feel his own truck beginning to struggle. The engine was running rough, and he could see ice forming on the inside of the windshield despite the heater running at full blast. The extreme cold was testing every mechanical system beyond its design limits. Bear's voice crackled over the radio from the truck behind them. "Jack, my engine temperature's all over the place. I don't think we're going to make it much further." Jack's heart sank. If Bear's truck died too, they would be stranded in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness with no shelter, no communication, and temperatures that could kill a person in minutes. He pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to cover as much ground as possible while they still had working vehicles. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of white. Snow was falling so heavily now that Jack's windshield wipers couldn't keep up, and the wind was creating drifts that threatened to block the road entirely. He had to make a decision: continue driving blind into potentially impassable conditions, or find some kind of shelter and hope they could survive until the storm passed. Then his engine began to make the same grinding sound that had preceded the failure of all the other vehicles. Jack felt a cold fear in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. They were about to be completely stranded. "Everyone hold on!" Jack called out to his passengers. "We need to find shelter, now." Through the blowing snow, he spotted what looked like a small building off to the right of the road. It was barely visible through the whiteout conditions, but it appeared to be some kind of abandoned structure. Jack turned off the road and drove toward it, his truck's engine coughing and sputtering with each yard they covered. They made it to the building just as Jack's engine died completely. Bear's truck pulled up beside them, and they could hear his engine making the same terrible sounds. Within minutes, both remaining vehicles fell silent, leaving 23 people stranded in the middle of an Arctic blizzard, with no transportation and no way to call for help. The building they had found was an old trapper's cabin, abandoned but still structurally sound. It was small, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, but it was shelter. As the group rushed to get everyone inside, Jack noticed that his thermometer now read minus 62 degrees Celsius, and the wind was making it feel even colder. Inside the cabin, 23 people huddled together in a space meant for maybe 4. There was an old wood stove, but no firewood. There were a few supplies left by previous occupants, some canned goods, a couple of blankets, basic tools, but nowhere near enough to sustain 23 people for any length of time. Dr. Chen immediately began checking everyone for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Several people were showing early symptoms, including young Emma Bradley, whose fingers had turned white despite her mittens. "We need to get a fire going," Bear said, stating the obvious. "Without heat, we won't last the night." Jack looked around the small cabin at the faces of the 22 people who were depending on him to get them out of this situation. There were children, elderly people, and individuals with no wilderness experience whatsoever. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and the snow continued to fall. The temperature was still dropping, and according to the weather radio they had managed to get working, it was going to get even worse before it got better. The storm system bringing this Arctic blast was unprecedented, and temperatures were expected to reach minus 70 degrees Celsius or lower. Bear managed to break up some old furniture and wooden crates to get a small fire started in the stove, but everyone knew that the fuel wouldn't last long. They had maybe enough wood for 12 hours if they were careful. After that, they would be completely at the mercy of the cold. As night fell, the true gravity of their situation became clear. They were stranded in one of the most remote areas of Alaska during the worst cold snap in recorded history. No one knew where they were. Their vehicles were dead, their radios couldn't reach anyone through the storm, and the temperature was still dropping. Jack sat near the small fire, his cowboy hat pushed back on his head, thinking about the impossible choice that was forming in his mind. Someone needed to go for help. Someone needed to make the journey back to the main road, back towards civilization, to bring rescue for the others. But in these conditions, walking outside was almost certainly a death sentence. The temperature had now reached minus 67 degrees Celsius. Outside the thin walls of the cabin, the Arctic night was becoming a frozen hell that could kill a person in minutes. Yet Jack Morrison, the cowboy from Texas who had never seen snow until he was 30, was beginning to consider doing the one thing that everyone would call absolute madness. He was thinking about walking back into that killing cold to save the 22 lives that depended on him. But first, they all needed to survive the night. And as the small fire in the stove began to die down and the cold started seeping through the cabin walls, Jack wasn't sure they were going to make it until morning. The small fire in the wood stove cast dancing shadows on the walls of the cramped cabin as 23 people huddled together, trying to share what little warmth they could generate. Outside, the Arctic wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the old wooden structure and finding every gap, every crack, every weakness in their fragile shelter. Jack Morrison sat with his back against the wall, watching the faces of the people around him in the flickering firelight. There was 8-year-old Emma Bradley pressed between her parents, her small face pale with cold despite being wrapped in every available blanket. There was Maria Santos, the tough camp cook, who had seen plenty of hard times but never anything like this. There was Dr. Chen, methodically checking each person for signs of hypothermia, her medical training the only thing keeping her focused, as their situation grew more desperate by the hour. The temperature outside had reached minus 69 degrees Celsius, and it was still falling. Jack's portable weather radio, one of the few pieces of equipment still working, crackled with updates from the National Weather Service. The meteorologist's voice sounded almost incredulous as he reported the readings. This is the most severe Arctic blast ever recorded in this region. Temperatures are expected to reach minus 70 to 1 degrees Celsius before dawn, with wind chills approaching minus 80 degrees. Bear Johnson fed another piece of broken furniture into the fire, watching as their precious fuel supply dwindled. "We've got maybe 6 hours of wood left," he said quietly to Jack. After that, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the cabin understood the mathematics of survival. Without heat, in temperatures approaching minus 80 degrees, they would all be dead within hours. Tom Bradley held his wife Susan and daughter Emma close, trying to be strong for his family, while inside he felt terror like nothing he had ever experienced. He was a communications technician, comfortable with electronics and radio systems, but completely unprepared for this kind of life and death survival situation. "Isn't there some way to fix one of the trucks?" he asked desperately. "Some way to get the engine working again?" Bear shook his head. "In this cold, metal becomes brittle as glass. Engine blocks crack, fuel lines freeze solid, batteries die completely. Even if we had a heated garage and all the right tools, it would take days to get any of those vehicles running again." Dr. Chen looked up from examining one of the miners who was showing early signs of frostbite on his toes. "We need to talk about rationing our body heat," she said clinically. "And we need to talk about the fact that some of us are not going to make it through the night if we don't get help soon." The words hung in the cold air like a death sentence. Everyone knew she was right, but hearing it spoken aloud made their desperate situation feel even more real. They had a little food, some canned goods from the abandoned cabin, plus whatever supplies they had managed to salvage from their vehicles before the engines died. But food wasn't the immediate problem. The immediate problem was heat, and they were running out of things to burn. Jack stood up and walked to the small window, peering out into the white void beyond. The snow was falling so heavily that he couldn't see more than a few feet. The wind was creating drifts that were already several feet high around the cabin. Even if someone could survive the cold long enough to walk for help, they would probably get lost in the whiteout conditions within minutes. But as Jack stared out into that frozen hell, an idea was forming in his mind. It was an insane idea. The kind of plan that would be called suicide by anyone with common sense. But as he listened to young Emma Bradley coughing in the cold air behind him, as he watched Bear feeding their last pieces of wooden furniture into the dying fire, Jack realized that insane ideas might be their only chance. "I know this area," he said suddenly, turning back to face the group. "I've been running supply routes through here for 3 years. There's a main highway about 12 miles east of here. If someone could make it to that highway, there's a truck stop about 5 miles north. They'd have communication equipment, heated shelters, everything we need." 12 miles? Maria stared at him in disbelief. "In this weather?" "Jack, that's suicide. No one could walk 12 miles in minus 70-degree weather." "Maybe," Jack said quietly. "But if no one tries, we're all going to die here. That fire's going to go out in a few hours and then we'll freeze to death one by one. At least if someone tries to get help, there's a chance." Bear, who understood the wilderness better than anyone in the group, shook his head firmly. "Jack, I've seen what this kind of cold does to people. You'd be dead within the first mile. Your lungs would freeze, your blood would literally start to thicken, your muscles would seize up. It's not just dangerous, it's impossible." "Doctor." Chen nodded in agreement. "Bear's right. The human body simply cannot function in temperatures approaching minus 80 degrees. Even with the best cold weather gear, which we don't have, exposure to that kind of cold would cause almost instant frostbite and hypothermia." But Jack was studying the supplies they had managed to salvage from their vehicles. There were sleeping bags, extra clothing, emergency supplies. Maybe, with the right preparation, with enough layers, with enough determination, what if we could create some kind of portable heat source, he asked. "Something to keep core body temperature up during the walk?" "With what?" Bear asked. "We don't have chemical hand warmers, we don't have a portable heater. We don't even have enough dry wood to keep this fire going much longer." Mike, one of Dr. Chen's graduate students, spoke up from where he sat huddled with his companion David. "What about body heat?" he said. "I mean, what if we used multiple sleeping bags, multiple layers, everything we have to create a kind of survival suit?" Tom Bradley, thinking like the technician he was, began to consider the logistics. "We've got 6 sleeping bags. If we nested them inside each other, with someone wearing every piece of extra clothing we have, it's still suicide," Bear insisted. "Even if someone could stay warm enough to survive the walk, how would they navigate in a complete whiteout? How would they stay on course? How would they even know which direction to go?" Jack pulled out his compass and map, spreading them on the floor near the fire. "I've got GPS coordinates for where we are, and I know exactly where the highway is. 12 miles due east. If I can stay on a straight bearing even in the storm." "If," Dr. Chen interrupted. "That's a very big if, Jack. And even if you somehow made it to the highway, even if you found help, how long would it take for rescue to get back here? We might all be dead by then anyway." The brutal logic of their situation was inescapable. They were trapped in a cabin with no heat, no communication, and no transportation, while outside the temperature was approaching levels that could kill a human being in minutes. Someone going for help was almost certainly a suicide mission, but staying put was almost certainly a death sentence for everyone. Young Emma Bradley began crying softly, the sound heartbreaking in the confines of the small cabin. Her parents held her close, but Jack could see the fear in their eyes. They knew, as everyone knew, that children were the most vulnerable to extreme cold. Emma might not survive the night, even if they kept the fire going. "There has to be another way," Susan Bradley said desperately. "Isn't there some way to signal for help? Some way to let someone know where we are?" Tom shook his head. "I've been trying the radio every 15 minutes. Nothing. The storm is blocking everything. We might as well be on the moon." Bear fed another piece of wood into the fire, and everyone watched as their lifeline grew a little smaller. 4 hours, he announced grimly. "Maybe 5 if we let it get really cold in here. After that, we've got nothing left to burn." Jack made his decision. He had been thinking about it for hours, and now he knew what he had to do. It was crazy, it was probably suicidal, but it was also the only chance any of them had. "I'm going," he said simply. "I'm going to try to reach the highway." The response was immediate and unanimous. "No," said Bear. "Absolutely not." "You'll die," said Dr. Chen. "It's impossible," said Tom. "Please don't leave us," whispered Emma. But Jack was already starting to gather supplies. "Look around," he said. "Look at what we're facing. In 5 hours, this fire goes out. An hour after that, the temperature in here drops to fatal levels. We'll freeze to death one by one, starting with Emma and working up to the strongest adults. That's not a theory. That's physics." He began pulling on layers of clothing. every piece of warm gear he could find. But if someone reaches that highway, if someone gets to that truck stop, rescue teams could be here in a few hours. Search and Rescue has helicopter support, heated vehicles, everything they need to get everyone out of here alive. Maria stood up, her face grim with determination. Then, I'm going with you. 2 people have a better chance than 1. No. Jack's voice was firm. 2 people means twice the risk that someone gets injured or lost, and it means using twice as much of our survival gear. 1 person has the best chance of making it, and if I don't make it, you'll still have all the gear here to help keep everyone else warm a little longer. Doctor? Chen was shaking her head. Jack, listen to me. I've studied hypothermia. I've studied the effects of extreme cold on human physiology. What you're proposing is medically impossible. Your body will shut down long before you cover 12 miles. But Jack had made up his mind. He was already layering sleeping bags around himself, creating a cocoon of insulation. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe I'll die out there, but if I don't try, we're all dead anyway. At least this gives everyone else a chance. Bear tried one more time to dissuade him. Jack, I've lived in Alaska for 15 years. I've seen storms that killed experienced outdoorsmen who were properly equipped and well prepared. This isn't just extreme weather. This is the kind of cold that kills everything living. Plants, animals, anything exposed to it for more than a few minutes. Jack finished his preparations and stood by the door, looking like a walking sleeping bag with arms and legs sticking out. He had layered every piece of clothing he could find, wrapped himself in multiple sleeping bags, and packed emergency supplies in a small backpack. He looked ridiculous, but everyone in the cabin knew they were looking at either their salvation or a man about to commit suicide. I'll head due east, Jack said, checking his compass one more time. 12 miles to the highway, then 5 miles north to the truck stop. If everything goes right, I should be able to get help here in maybe 8 to 10 hours. And if everything goes wrong? Tom asked quietly. Jack looked around at the faces of the 22 people he was leaving behind. Faces filled with fear, hope, and desperate gratitude that someone was willing to try.
If everything goes wrong, then at least you'll know someone tried.
And maybe it'll buy you enough time for the storm to pass, for someone else to find you. He opened the door, and immediately the screaming wind tried to tear it from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin, and the temperature inside dropped noticeably in the few seconds the door was open. Through the gap, everyone could see the white void beyond, a landscape so hostile and alien that it seemed like the surface of another planet. Remember, Jack called back over the wind, keep the fire going as long as possible, stay together for body heat, and don't give up. I'm going to make it to that highway, and I'm going to bring help back. He stepped out into the frozen hell of the Alaskan night, and Bear quickly slammed the door behind him. Inside the cabin, 22 people huddled together around their dying fire, listening to the sound of Jack's footsteps disappearing into the storm. Outside, the temperature had reached minus 71 degrees Celsius, and the wind was creating conditions that felt like minus 85 degrees. It was cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in 30 seconds, cold enough to kill a person in minutes, cold enough to challenge every limit of human survival. And Jack Morrison, the cowboy from Texas, who had never seen snow until he was 30, began walking east through the darkness toward a highway that might as well have been on the other side of the world. Behind him, 22 lives depended on his success. Ahead of him, 12 miles of frozen wasteland waited to kill him. The most incredible rescue story in Alaska's history had begun. Jack Morrison took his first step into the frozen wasteland and immediately understood that he was walking into a world that wanted to kill him. The cold hit him like a physical blow, finding every gap in his makeshift survival suit, every weak point in his layered defenses. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him over, and the snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see his own feet. He adjusted his improvised face mask, a combination of scarves, bandanas, and torn fabric that covered everything except his eyes, and checked his compass. Due east, 12 miles. In weather conditions that made the surface of Mars look hospitable, the first 100 yards were the hardest. Jack's body was in shock from the extreme cold, and every instinct screamed at him to turn around and run back to the cabin. His lungs burned with each breath as the frigid air felt like ice crystals forming in his chest. His eyes watered constantly, and the tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. But Jack forced himself to keep walking. Behind him, 22 people were counting on him. Emma Bradley's pale, frightened face was burned into his memory. He had promised them he would bring help, and Jack Morrison had never broken a promise in his life. The snow was knee-deep in most places, deeper in the drifts that the wind had created. Each step was a struggle, each movement an act of will. The multiple sleeping bags wrapped around his body made movement awkward and difficult, but they were the only thing keeping him alive. Without them, he would have been dead within minutes. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Jack stopped to check his progress. He pulled out his compass and GPS unit and cursing when he saw that the GPS was already starting to malfunction in the extreme cold. But his compass still worked, and according to his calculations, he had covered maybe half a mile, 11.5 miles to go. The mathematics were terrifying. At this pace, in these conditions, it would take him over 8 hours to reach the highway. But Jack knew he couldn't maintain even this slow pace for 8 hours. The cold was already sapping his strength, making every movement more difficult. His fingers were going numb despite his heavy gloves, and his feet felt like blocks of ice in his boots. He forced himself to keep moving. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other. Don't think about the distance. Don't think about the cold. Just walk. The wind was the worst part. It wasn't just cold, it was malevolent, seeming to search out every weakness in his defenses. It found gaps between his layers of clothing and drove frigid air directly against his skin. It whipped snow into his face so hard that each flake felt like a tiny needle. It tried to knock him off course, to turn him around, to confuse his sense of direction. But Jack had spent years navigating by compass and stars during his time as a cowboy in Texas. Even in these impossible conditions, he could maintain his bearing. Due east? Oh, always due east. No matter how the wind tried to push him north or south, no matter how the blowing snow tried to confuse him, he kept his compass steady and held his course. The second mile was harder than the first. Jack's body was using enormous amounts of energy just to stay warm, and the deep snow made every step a monumental effort. He was breathing hard, which was dangerous in this cold. Each breath was taking precious body heat and replacing it with air that was cold enough to freeze his lungs. He had to rest. Jack found a large boulder that provided a tiny bit of wind shelter and collapsed against it, pulling his sleeping bag layers tight around him. The break felt good, but within minutes he could feel the cold seeping through his defenses. Staying still was almost as dangerous as walking. He checked his watch. He had been walking for an hour and 15 minutes. When he stood up to continue, Jack realized that his legs were starting to stiffen. The extreme cold was affecting his muscle function, making movement more difficult. This was one of the early signs of hypothermia that Dr. D.A. Chen had warned everyone about. His core body temperature was dropping despite all his layers of protection, but he forced himself to keep going. The alternative was death, not just for him, but for everyone back in that cabin. Emma Bradley's face appeared in his mind again, and Jack found the strength to take another step, and another. The third mile almost killed him. The snow had gotten deeper, and Jack found himself post-holing through drifts that sometimes came up to his chest. Each time he fell through into a deep drift, he had to struggle to pull himself out, using precious energy and exposing himself to even more cold. His breathing became labored, and he could feel his heart pounding with the effort. Worse, his homemade face mask was becoming a liability. His breath was freezing on the fabric, creating a layer of ice that made breathing difficult. But he couldn't remove it. Exposing his face to the direct wind would cause instant frostbite. He had to stop every few hundred yards to scrape the ice away from the breathing holes. Halfway through the third mile, Jack fell through a snowdrift and landed hard on his left knee. Pain shot through his leg, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might have injured something seriously. He lay in the snow for several minutes, fighting off panic before determining that nothing was broken. But his knee was throbbing, and walking became even more difficult. The fourth mile was when Jack started to hallucinate. The extreme cold, the physical exhaustion, and the stress of the situation were taking their toll on his mind. He began to see shapes in the blowing snow. Trees that weren't there, buildings that turned out to be rocks, people walking toward him who disappeared when he got closer. At one point, Jack was certain he could see the lights of the highway ahead of him, and he stumbled forward eagerly, only to realize that he was seeing the reflection of stars off ice crystals in the wind. The highway was still miles away, and he was less than a third of the way there. But the hallucinations also brought some comfort. Jack began to see his father, the old cowboy who had taught him everything about determination and never giving up. His father walked beside him in the snow, encouraging him, telling him he could make it. Jack knew it wasn't real, but the vision gave him strength. You always were too stubborn to know when to quit. His father's voice seemed to say, "That's going to save your life today, son." The fifth mile nearly broke him. Jack's movements had slowed to a shuffle, and he was stopping to rest every few hundred yards. His feet were completely numb now, and he was terrified that he might be getting frostbite, but he couldn't stop to check. Removing his boots in these conditions would be suicide. His hands were becoming less functional too. Even through heavy gloves and multiple layers, the cold was affecting his dexterity. It took him longer and longer to check his compass, and he had to be careful not to drop it. If he lost his compass, he would be walking blind into the wilderness. The wind seemed to be getting stronger. If that was possible, several times gusts knocked Jack completely off his feet, and he had to crawl on his hands and knees until he could stand again. The snow was coming at him horizontally now, driven by winds that had to be at least 60 miles per hour. But somehow, Jack kept walking, one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. When his legs threatened to give out, he thought about Maria Santos, the tough cook who had trusted him to bring help. When his hands became so numb he could barely hold his compass, he thought about Tom and Susan Bradley, holding their daughter and watching their only hope walk into the storm. The 6 mile was a blur of pain and cold and determination. Jack's vision was becoming limited, not just because of the blowing snow, but because the extreme cold was affecting his body's ability to function. He could feel hypothermia setting in, despite all his preparation and all his layers of protection. His thinking was becoming foggy, another dangerous sign. Several times, Jack found himself walking in the wrong direction, following his compass needle backwards or sideways. He had to stop and carefully reorient himself each time, fighting through the mental confusion that extreme cold was causing. But he was past the halfway point now. 6 miles down, 6 miles to go. The knowledge gave him a tiny boost of hope, even as his body was reaching the limits of what it could endure. The 7th mile was when Jack started to understand that he might not make it. His movements had slowed to barely more than a crawl. Each step took enormous effort, and he was stopping to rest more often than he was walking. The cold had penetrated every layer of his defenses, and his core body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. His feet had lost all feeling, and Jack was terrified that he might be walking on frostbitten stumps. His hands were so numb that he could barely operate his compass. Several times he dropped it in the snow and had to dig frantically to find it, knowing that losing his navigation tool would mean certain death. But somehow, impossibly, he kept going. When his legs wouldn't support him, he crawled. When crawling became too difficult, he forced himself to stand and stumble forward. The image of that cabin full of people kept him moving when his body wanted to quit. The 8th mile was a nightmare of cold and exhaustion. Jack was hallucinating constantly now, seeing rescue helicopters that weren't there, hearing voices calling to him from the storm. His body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core warmth, and his thinking was becoming increasingly confused. At one point, Jack realized he had been walking south instead of east for nearly 20 minutes. He had lost his bearing completely, following some imaginary landmark that his confused mind had created. The mistake could have been fatal. If he had continued much longer in the wrong direction, he would have been hopelessly lost in the wilderness. But his cowboy training, ingrained through decades of navigating by the stars and following cattle across trackless prairie, saved him. Even in his confused state, some part of his mind recognized that he was off course. He stopped, pulled out his compass with fingers that barely functioned, and slowly, carefully, reoriented himself toward the east. The 9th mile almost finished him. Jack fell through a snowdrift and couldn't get up. He lay in the snow, completely exhausted, feeling the cold seeping through his remaining defenses. It would be so easy to just close his eyes and rest. So easy to just stop fighting and let the cold take him. But then he heard Emma Bradley's voice, carried on the wind. "Please don't leave us." It wasn't real. He knew it wasn't real, but it was enough. Jack forced himself to stand, forced himself to take another step. And another. His salvation came from an unexpected source. The extreme cold that was trying to kill him had also created something that helped him. The snow was so frozen that in some places it formed a crust strong enough to support his weight. For stretches of several hundred yards at a time, Jack could walk on top of the snow instead of struggling through it. These brief respites gave him just enough relief to keep going. His pace picked up slightly, and for the first time in hours, Jack began to believe he might actually make it. The 10th mile was a race against time and hypothermia. Jack could feel his body shutting down, could feel death approaching with each step, but he could also sense that he was getting close to the highway. The terrain was changing, becoming more open, more flat. He was walking on what used to be farmland before it was abandoned to the wilderness. His compass became harder and harder to read as his vision blurred and his hands shook with cold. But he kept checking it obsessively, terrified of getting lost when he was so close to help. Due east. Always due east. The highway was out there somewhere, and people were counting on him to find it. The 11th mile was pure willpower. Jack's body had nothing left to give, but his mind refused to quit. Every step was agony. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment was a choice between continuing and giving up. He chose to continue. And then, impossibly, through the blowing snow and the darkness, Jack saw a light. At first he thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick his mind was playing on him. But as he stumbled closer, the light remained constant. Real. It was a streetlight, barely visible through the storm, but unmistakably man-made. He had found the highway. Jack Morrison, the cowboy from Texas who had warped 12 miles through killing cold, collapsed in the snow beside the road and began to cry. Not from despair, but from relief. He had made it. Against all odds, against every prediction, against the brutal mathematics of survival in extreme cold, he had made it to the highway. Now, he just had to find help. The truck stop was still 5 miles away to the north, and Jack wasn't sure he could walk another 500 yards, let alone 5 miles. But he had come this far. He couldn't quit now. 22 people were depending on him. And Jack Morrison had never broken a promise in his life. Somehow, someway, he was going to bring help back to that cabin. The most incredible part of his journey was still ahead of him. Jack Morrison lay in the snow beside the highway, his body racked with exhaustion and hypothermia, staring at the most beautiful sight he had ever seen, a stretch of asphalt that represented civilization, help, and hope. But the highway was empty. No traffic moved in either direction, which wasn't surprising given the extreme weather conditions. The truck stop was still 5 miles north, and Jack wasn't sure his body had 5 miles left in it. He forced himself to stand, swaying dangerously as waves of dizziness washed over him. The 12-mile walk through the killing cold had pushed his body far beyond its normal limits. His core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and he was showing all the signs of severe hypothermia. Confusion, exhaustion, loss of coordination, and a dangerous desire to just lie down and sleep. But sleep meant death. Not just for him, but for the 22 people huddled in that cabin, watching their fire die and their hope fade. Jack pulled his layers tighter around him and began walking north along the highway, following the barely visible white lines that marked the road's edge. The walking was easier on the paved surface, even though it was covered with several inches of snow. At least he wasn't post-holding through deep drifts anymore. But the improved footing came with a new danger. The highway was more exposed to the wind than the wilderness had been, and the Arctic blast hit him with full force, threatening to knock him down with every step. Jack had been walking for about 20 minutes when he saw headlights approaching from the south. His heart leapt with relief and hope as he stepped into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. This was it. Rescue, help, salvation for everyone back at the cabin. But the vehicle, a large truck struggling through the storm, didn't stop. The driver probably couldn't see Jack clearly through the blowing snow, or maybe thought he was seeing things. The truck crawled past at maybe 10 miles per hour, its taillights disappearing into the white void ahead. Jack stood in the middle of the empty highway and screamed his frustration into the wind. He had come so far, endured so much, and now help had literally driven right past him, but he couldn't give up. Not now, not when he was so close. He continued walking north, checking his compass constantly to make sure he was still heading in the right direction. The truck stop had to be closed now. He had been walking for over an hour since reaching the highway, covering maybe 3 miles at his slow pace. 2 miles to go, maybe less. The hallucinations were getting worse. Jack kept seeing buildings that turned out to be snowdrifts, lights that were actually reflections off ice, and people walking toward him who vanished when he got closer. His mind was playing tricks on him, a common symptom of severe hypothermia, but he had enough awareness left to recognize most of the false visions for what they were. Then he saw something that made his heart stop. Through the blowing snow, barely visible in the darkness, was a glow of lights. Not the single point of a street light or the moving beams of a vehicle, but the diffused glow of multiple lights clustered together. A building, the truck stop. Jack stumbled forward with renewed energy, afraid to believe it was real until he got closer. But as he approached, the vision didn't disappear. It was real. A large truck stop with several buildings, fuel pumps, and most importantly, lights that meant power and heat and communication equipment. But getting there was harder than Jack had anticipated. The truck stop was set back from the highway about 200 yards, and the access road was completely blocked with snowdrifts. Jack had to climb over and through drifts that were taller than he was, using the last of his strength to reach the main building. When he finally reached the door, Jack realized he faced a new problem. His hands were so numb and uncoordinated that he couldn't grasp the door handle. He stood there for several minutes, frantically trying to get his frozen fingers to work before finally managing to hook his arm around the handle and pull the door open. The blast of warm air that hit him when he stumbled into the truck stop felt like a physical miracle. After hours in killing cold, the normal indoor temperature felt tropical. Jack's eyes watered from the warmth, and his frozen face began to sting as feelings slowly returned. The truck stop was nearly empty, just a night clerk behind the counter and 2 truck drivers sitting at a table drinking coffee and waiting for the storm to pass. All 3 men stared in amazement as what looked like a walking snowman stumbled through their door and collapsed on the floor. "Jesus Christ," one of the truckers said, jumping up from his table. "What the hell are you doing out in this weather?" Jack tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. His throat was raw from breathing the frigid air, and his lips were so numb he could barely form words. "Help," he managed to croak. "Need help. 22 people. Stranded." The night clerk, a young man named Danny Williams, rushed around from behind the counter. "Call 911, he told one of the truckers, then knelt beside Jack. "Sir, you need to get warm. You've got severe hypothermia. We need to get these wet clothes off you and get your core temperature up." But Jack grabbed Danny's arm with what little strength he had left. "No time," he whispered urgently. 22 people. Cabin. Dying. One of the truckers, an older man named Pete Rodriguez, who had been driving these routes for 20 years, understood immediately. "He's talking about people stranded somewhere. How far?" he asked Jack. Jack fumbled for his compass and map with hands that barely functioned. 12 miles, he managed. Due west. Old cabin. Fires dying. Children. Pete looked at the other trucker and nodded grimly. They both understood the implications. If people were stranded without heat in this weather, every minute counted. "Danny, get on that phone to search and rescue. Tell them we've got multiple people stranded in extreme weather conditions. Give them these coordinates." While Danny made the emergency call, Pete and the other trucker, Mike Santos, helped Jack out of his frozen outer layers and wrapped him in blankets. They forced warm coffee down his throat and began the process of treating his hypothermia. "Sir, what's your name?" Pete asked. "Jack Morrison," Jack managed to say, his voice getting a little stronger as the warmth began to penetrate his body. "Jack, I need you to listen to me," Pete said. "You're in bad shape. Severe hypothermia, probably frostbite on your hands and feet. You need immediate medical attention. But first, I need exact details about where these people are." Jack forced his mind to focus, fighting through the confusion that hypothermia had caused. He described the route they had taken, the location where their vehicles had broken down, the abandoned cabin they had found. He gave Pete the GPS coordinates he had recorded, though he wasn't sure how accurate they were after his long walk through the storm. Danny finished his call and turned back to them. "Search and rescue is mobilizing, but they say the weather conditions are too severe for helicopter operations. They're going to try to get a ground team together, but it could take hours." "Hours?" Jack struggled to sit up, panic in his voice. "They don't have hours. The fire was almost out when I left." "That was... how long ago?" Pete checked his watch and calculated. "Based on what you've told me about your walk, you left that cabin maybe 6 or 7 hours ago. If their fire died after you left..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood. If the people in that cabin had been without heat for several hours in -70-degree weather, some of them might already be dead. "I'm going back," Jack said, trying to stand up. "I know exactly where they are. I can guide a rescue team." "No," Pete said firmly, pushing Jack back down. "You're in no condition to go anywhere. Your core body temperature is still dangerously low, and you probably have frostbite. You'd be dead within minutes if you went back out there." But Mike Santos was already putting on his heavy winter gear. "I've got a snowmobile on my trailer," he said. "It's designed for extreme conditions. If I can get exact directions, I might be able to get there faster than a ground rescue team." Jack grabbed Mike's arm. "Take me with you. I know the way. In this weather, with the visibility, you'll never find them without me." "Absolutely not," Danny said. "You need medical attention. We should be getting you to a hospital, not sending you back into that storm." But Jack was already struggling to put his frozen outer layers back on. 22 people, he said, including an 8-year-old girl. I promised them I'd bring help. I'm not breaking that promise now." Pete looked at Mike and saw his own thoughts reflected in the other man's eyes. In conditions this extreme with visibility near zero, having someone who knew the exact location could mean the difference between success and failure, but sending Jack back out in his condition was probably a death sentence. "There might be another way," Pete said slowly. What if we rig up some kind of communication system? You could ride behind Mike on the snowmobile and guide him by voice, but stay bundled up and protected.
Mike nodded. I've got a 2-seater snowmobile, and it's got a windscreen and some weather protection.
If we bundled Jack up in survival gear and kept him conscious long enough to provide directions, Danny was shaking his head. This is insane. You're talking about taking a man with severe hypothermia back into killing weather on a snowmobile. That's 3 ways to die right there. But Jack was already moving toward the door. Every minute we argue is another minute those people are dying, he said. I know where they are. I can get Mike there. That's what matters. The decision was made in that moment. Mike finished gearing up and went out to prepare his snowmobile, while Pete and Danny helped Jack get back into his survival layers. They added extra gear from the truck stop's emergency supplies, chemical hand warmers, additional blankets, a helmet with a face shield to protect against the wind. Jack, Pete said as they prepared to leave, are you sure about this? Because once you're out there, there's no turning back. If something goes wrong, Jack looked at him with eyes that had seen too much cold and too much suffering. There are 22 people counting on me, he said simply. I'm not letting them down. Mike's snowmobile roared to life in the parking lot, its engine designed to function in extreme Arctic conditions. Jack climbed on behind him and they attached a communication cord so Jack could give directions even over the noise of the engine and the howling wind. As they prepared to leave, Danny ran out with one final piece of equipment, a GPS device programmed with the coordinates of the cabin and a route back to the truck stop. Backup navigation, he shouted over the wind. In case anything happens to either of you. Pete clasped Jack's shoulder through his layers of protection. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest, he said. Probably both. Jack managed a weak smile. Sometimes there's not much difference. Mike gunned the engine, and the snowmobile lurched forward into the storm. Behind them, the warm lights of the truck stop disappeared into the white void. Ahead of them, 12 miles of frozen wilderness waited, along with 22 people who might already be dead. But Jack Morrison, the cowboy from Texas who had already walked through hell once tonight, was going back because he had made a promise, and he had never broken a promise in his life. The most dangerous part of the rescue was just beginning. The snowmobile carved through the storm like a knife through the darkness, carrying 2 men on a mission that would either save 2 lives or kill everyone involved. In weather that could freeze a person solid in minutes, they were racing against time, cold, and death itself. And somewhere in the wilderness ahead, in a cabin growing colder by the minute, 22 people huddled together and waited for help that might never come. The snowmobile raced through the Arctic hell at speeds that would have been suicidal in normal conditions. But Mike Santos was an experienced rider who understood that speed was their only ally against the killing cold. Behind him, Jack Morrison huddled against the machine's minimal windscreen, using his hard-won knowledge of the terrain to guide them through the white void toward the cabin where 22 lives hung in the balance. "Bear left here!" Jack shouted into his helmet microphone as they approached a barely visible landmark he remembered from his walk. The communication system was crackling with static from the extreme weather, but Mike could hear him well enough to follow directions. The ride was a nightmare of cold and speed and desperate hope. Even with the snowmobile's protection and his layers of survival gear, Jack could feel the Arctic air finding every gap, every weakness in his defenses. The wind chill created by their movement made the already deadly temperature feel even more lethal. But every minute they traveled on, the snowmobile was worth 30 minutes of walking. And time was the one thing the people in that cabin didn't have. "How much further?" Mike called back through the comm system. Jack checked the GPS unit Pete had given them, though the screen was difficult to read through his frozen face mask. "Maybe 3 miles, he estimated. We should see the cabin lights soon." But when they crested the next rise, there were no lights visible anywhere ahead of them. Just more endless white wilderness disappearing into the storm. Jack felt a cold fear in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. If the cabin was dark, it might mean the worst had already happened. "No lights," Mike observed grimly, slowing the snowmobile slightly. "Maybe their flashlights died," Jack said, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "Or maybe they're conserving batteries." "Keep going straight." They rode in tense silence for another 10 minutes before Jack spotted something that made his heart jump. "There," he shouted, pointing toward a dark shape barely visible through the blowing snow. "That's it. That's the cabin." Mike gunned the snowmobile toward the structure, and as they got closer, they could see that it was indeed the cabin Jack had left hours earlier, but it was completely dark, and there was no smoke coming from the chimney. No sign of life at all. Mike shut off the snowmobile engine, and the sudden silence was filled only by the howling wind. They dismounted quickly and ran toward the cabin door. Jack pounded on it with his numb fists. "It's Jack," he yelled. "I brought help. Open up." For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then they heard movement inside, and the door opened to reveal Bear Johnson's face, pale and exhausted but alive. "Jack?" Bear said in disbelief. "Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. How did you—" "No time," Jack interrupted, pushing past Bear into the cabin. "We need to get everyone out of here. Now." What Jack saw inside the cabin nearly broke his heart. The 22 people he had left behind were huddled together in the center of the small room, wrapped in every available blanket and piece of clothing. The fire in the wood stove had died hours ago, and the temperature inside the cabin was now only marginally warmer than the deadly cold outside. Several people appeared to be unconscious, including young Emma Bradley, who lay motionless in her parents' arms. Chen was moving among the group, checking pulses and breathing. Her medical training the only thing keeping her functional as hypothermia set in. "How many are still responsive?" Mike asked, immediately understanding the gravity of the situation. "Maybe half," Dr. Chen replied weakly. "The others, I don't know. Some might already be." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jack knelt beside the Bradley family. Emma was unconscious but breathing, her small face pale with cold. Tom and Susan were conscious but barely responsive, their movements sluggish with hypothermia. "We can only take 2 people at a time on the snowmobile," Mike said. "And in these conditions, with people in this condition, each trip is going to take at least an hour round trip." The mathematics were brutal. 22 people, 2 at a time, would require 11 trips. At an hour per trip, that was 11 hours minimum. In temperatures that were still dropping, many of the people in the cabin wouldn't survive that long. "We start with the weakest," Jack decided. Emma first, with one of her parents. "Dr. Chen, who else is in the most immediate danger?" Dr. Chen pointed to an elderly miner named Frank Peterson who appeared to be unconscious and barely breathing. "Him." And Maria's showing signs of severe hypothermia too. As they prepared to move the first group, Bear grabbed Jack's arm. "I can't believe you made it," he said. "When you left here, we all thought it was suicide. How did you survive 12 miles in that cold?" "I had to," Jack said simply. "You were all counting on me." They loaded Emma and Susan Bradley onto the snowmobile, wrapping them in every available blanket and using chemical hand warmers to try to maintain their body heat during the ride. Susan was barely conscious but managed to hold onto her daughter as Mike prepared to make the first trip back to the truck stop. "Get them to the hospital as fast as you can," Jack told Mike. "I'll stay here and keep everyone else alive until you get back." Mike nodded and fired up the snowmobile. As the machine disappeared into the storm, Jack turned back to the cabin and began the process of triage, determining who would go next, who could wait, and who might not survive long enough for rescue to reach them. Inside the cabin, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without the snowmobile's engine noise, everyone could hear the wind growing stronger outside. The storm was intensifying and the temperature was still dropping. Jack's weather radio crackled with updates that made everyone's blood run cold. The temperature had now reached minus 73 degrees Celsius, with wind chills approaching minus 90. "How long until Mike gets back?" Tom Bradley asked, his voice slurred with cold and exhaustion. Jack checked his watch, though the numbers were hard to read in the dim light from their failing flashlights. "Maybe an hour and a half, if everything goes right." But everything didn't go right. Mike's voice crackled over the portable radio he had left with Jack, reporting mechanical problems with the snowmobile. "Engines running rough," Mike reported. "I can make it back to the truck stop with these 2, but I don't know if the machine will make another trip." Jack felt despair wash over him. If the snowmobile broke down, they were back where they started, stranded in the wilderness with no way to get help and no way to keep everyone alive until morning. "What about search and rescue?" Jack radioed back. "Are they on their way? Ground team is trying to get through, but they're having problems with their vehicles too. This cold is killing everything mechanical. They might not reach you for hours." Hours. Jack looked around at the 20 people still trapped in the cabin with him. Several more had lost consciousness since Mike left, and Dr. Moses. Chen was growing increasingly worried about everyone's core body temperature. But then Jack had an idea. It was desperate, probably impossible, but it was better than sitting there waiting for everyone to die. "What if we didn't wait for rescue to come to us?" he asked Bear. "What if we brought people to the rescue?" Bear stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we started walking? Not all of us, but the ones who can still move. If we can get even some people closer to the highway, closer to help. Doctor. Chen shook her head weakly. Jack, most of these people can barely stand, let alone walk 12 miles through this weather. Not 12 miles, Jack said. Mike made it maybe 8 miles before his snowmobile started having problems. If we could get people even 4 or 5 miles toward the highway, we could meet the rescue teams halfway. It was an insane plan. Moving people with severe hypothermia through killing cold was medically inadvisable in the extreme. But Jack looked around at the faces of the people depending on him and realized that following normal medical advice was going to get everyone killed. Who can walk? He asked. Slowly, painfully, 8 people managed to raise their hands or nod their heads. It wasn't many, but it was something. Bear Doctor.
Chen, Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, 2 of the miners, and 2 others who were still functional enough to move.
We leave the others here, with all the warm gear we can spare, Jack decided.
We take the ones who can walk and start moving toward the highway. When we meet the rescue team, we guide them back here for the others. It was a plan born of desperation, but it was the only chance any of them had. They gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to leave the cabin that had been their shelter and was now becoming their tomb. As they prepared to leave, Jack knelt beside the people who were too weak to walk. Frank Peterson, the elderly miner, was unconscious but still breathing. 3 others were in similar condition, alive but unable to move. We're going to bring help back, Jack promised them. Just hold on, don't give up. The group of 9 people, Jack, Bear, Dr. Chen, Tom Bradley, Maria Santos, and 4 others, stepped out of the cabin into the frozen hell of the Arctic night. The temperature had now reached minus 74 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill exposed flesh in seconds. But they started walking, 1 foot in front of the other, supporting each other when someone stumbled, sharing warmth when someone fell behind. Jack led the way, using his compass and GPS to guide them toward the highway, where help was waiting. It was the most difficult walk any of them had ever taken. Several people collapsed and had to be carried by the others. Dr. Chen developed severe frostbite on her fingers. Maria Santos fell through a snowdrift and had to be pulled out by Bear and Tom working together. But somehow, impossibly, they kept moving. And after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, they saw lights ahead of them. Not the single lights of the highway, but the multiple lights of vehicles. Search and rescue had finally made it through the storm. The rescue team leader, a veteran Alaska State Trooper named Captain Sarah Mitchell, couldn't believe what she was seeing as 9 people stumbled out of the blizzard toward her vehicles. Are you the stranded group? She called out. Some of us, Jack replied, his voice barely audible over the wind. There are 13 more back at the cabin. Some of them might not have much time. Captain Mitchell immediately mobilized her team. They loaded the 9 survivors into heated rescue vehicles and prepared to follow Jack's directions back to the cabin. But the journey that had taken Jack, and the others 90 minutes to walk, took the rescue vehicles over 2 hours to navigate in the storm conditions. When they finally reached the cabin, they found a scene that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The 13 people who had been left behind were all unconscious. Their core body temperatures dropped to levels that were barely compatible with life. Frank Peterson, the elderly miner, had died while the others were making their desperate walk to meet the rescue team. But the other 12 were still alive. Barely, but alive. The rescue team worked frantically to stabilize them and get them to hospitals, using every piece of medical equipment and expertise they had. The final count, when all the survivors were accounted for, was almost miraculous. Of the 23 people who had been stranded in the worst Arctic weather in Alaska's recorded history, 22 had survived. Only Frank Peterson had been lost to the cold. Jack Morrison, the cowboy from Texas who had never seen snow until he was 30, had walked through killing cold twice in one night and had saved 22 lives. When reporters later asked him how he had managed such an impossible feat, Jack's answer was simple. I made a promise, he said, and I don't break promises. The story of Jack Morrison's rescue became legendary throughout Alaska and the Arctic regions. It was studied by survival experts, cold weather specialists, and emergency responders. It became a case study in human determination and the will to survive. But for Jack, the most important part of the story was much simpler. 3 weeks after the rescue, when everyone had recovered from their ordeal, he received a drawing in the mail. It was from Emma Bradley, the 8-year-old girl whose pale, frightened face had given him the strength to keep walking when his body wanted to quit. The drawing showed a man in a cowboy hat walking through snow, with a cabin full of people in the background and a rainbow overhead. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for keeping your promise." Jack Morrison framed that drawing and hung it in his home in Texas, where he had returned after his time in Alaska. And whenever anyone asked him about the coldest night in recorded history, when he had walked through hell itself to save 22 lives, Jack would point to that simple drawing and smile. "That's all that mattered," he would say, "keeping my promise to a little girl." The temperature that night had reached minus 74 degrees Celsius. Jack Morrison had walked through it twice and lived to tell about it. But more importantly, 22 other people had lived to tell about it too, because one cowboy from Texas refused to break a promise he had made to a frightened child in a frozen cabin at the end of the world.